Let me!
Step back!
Step back! Now!
I shot the HOA President Karen on my ranch, and the second, the sound echoed across the pasture. Everything stopped. My dog was still screaming, dust hanging in the air. Karen frozen mid-step where she didn't belong. One moment, she was shouting about authority and access. The next moment, the land itself went silent, like it was holding its breath. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I stood there, knowing whatever happened next would decide everything: my freedom, my home, my future. Sirens weren't far behind, and neither was the version of the story she was already preparing to tell. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from right now. Because this isn't just about a gunshot. It's about what happens when someone crosses the wrong boundary and thinks power will protect them. I didn't fire because I was angry and not because I wanted to scare anyone. I fired because the moment demanded clarity, not hesitation. But to understand why I didn't panic after that sound ripped through the ranch, you need to understand who I am and why I chose this place in the first place. My name is Ethan Rowe, and long before I ever owned cattle land or fixed fence posts at sunrise, my life revolved around risk restraint and knowing exactly when not to pull the trigger. I spent years working in environments where reacting too fast got people killed, and reacting too slow did the same. And when I finally walked away from that life, I promised myself something simple. I would never again live somewhere my boundaries were unclear. That's why this ranch mattered. It wasn't just land, it was distance, quiet, and rules written in deeds, not personalities. My wife Laura understood that better than anyone. She had watched me come home from jobs where silence meant survival, where details mattered more than emotions, and when we decided to leave the city, it wasn't to hide, it was to breathe. We wanted space for our kids, Noah, who was 10 and obsessed with animals, and Claire, 8 years old and fearless, in ways that still scared me. They learned early that fences weren't decoration, they were promises. A fence meant safety. A gate meant permission. A posted sign meant stop. That's the lesson I thought everyone understood. I was wrong. The ranch sat outside town limits, outside subdivisions, outside the neat boxes people like Karen relied on to feel important. It had been agricultural land for decades, passed down with records thicker than most HOA rulebooks, and every inch of it was documented, surveyed, and boringly legal. I chose it that way on purpose. No shared driveways, no common amenities, no committees. Just land, livestock, and responsibility. When the nearby development expanded and wrapped itself around the outer edge of my property, I didn't worry. Paper doesn't move fences, and popularity doesn't rewrite deeds. Or at least, it isn't supposed to. I kept to myself, fixed what needed fixing, and stayed invisible, which is usually enough to avoid trouble, until it isn't. Trouble doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it starts with assumptions. Sometimes, it starts with someone else's confidence, growing faster than their authority. Karen arrived in this story long before she stepped onto my pasture. Even if I didn't know her name yet, she was the kind of person who believed leadership meant presence, that being seen was the same as being right. Her HOA meetings were loud from what I'd heard, full of rules explained with smiles, sharp enough to cut, and she had a reputation for cleaning things up. People said it like it was a compliment, but there was always a pause after. The kind that told you compliance was expected, not requested. I stayed clear of all that. I wasn't part of her world, and I liked it that way. The problem was she didn't see it like that. To Karen, borders were flexible if they stood in the way of what she wanted done. Paths could be extended. Access could be assumed. And land that had been quiet for years suddenly looked like unused opportunity. The first time I noticed something was off, it wasn't dramatic. It was a fresh set of footprints near my back fence, too deliberate to be accidental, cutting across ground my cattle avoided. Then came a temporary marker, bright plastic, pushed into soil that didn't belong to anyone but me. I removed it and thought nothing of it. People make mistakes. Or at least they should be allowed to correct them. A week later, another marker appeared, closer this time, and a laminated notice zip tied to my fence, explaining future community improvements. No name, no signature, just assumption printed in bold. I documented it, removed it again, and sent a certified notice to the development office clarifying boundaries. No response. Silence can mean many things, but in disputes like this, it usually means someone is deciding how hard to push. By the time Karen stepped onto my land that evening, none of this felt random. It felt earned, like the final step in a decision she'd already made. She wasn't there to ask, but she was there because, in her mind, the ranch was already hers to manage. And when my dog reacted the way any trained guard animal would to a stranger crossing a posted fence, she didn't retreat but escalated. That's the part people like her never understand. Animals don't recognize titles. They recognize threats. And when someone chooses to respond to that, with force instead of distance, the situation stops being administrative and becomes real in a way paperwork never can. After the shot, as the echo faded and the air stayed tense, I wasn't thinking about Karen. I was thinking about sequence, about what would be said, what would be recorded, and how fast narratives harden once authority gets involved. I knew police would come, and I knew she would speak first if she could. People like Karen always do. They rely on momentum, on shock, on the assumption that whoever looks calm must be guilty of something. I had learned a long time ago that calm is not weakness, it's preparation. I stood there with my dog pressed against my leg, heart steady, mind clear, knowing this moment wasn't the climax. Everything after would depend on what could be proven, not what could be shouted, and as the distant sound of sirens began to drift across the fields, I understood something with absolute certainty. Karen had crossed onto land she didn't understand, against a man who did, and whatever story she thought she was writing, had just left her control. Karen didn't introduce herself the first time we spoke. She didn't have to. People like her assume recognition comes with the role. It happened a few days after the markers kept reappearing, when a white SUV stopped just short of my main gate, tires crunching slowly, like she wanted the sound to announce her arrival. She stepped out wearing confidence the way others wear uniforms, clipboard tucked under her arm, phone already in her hand, scanning my land as if she were taking inventory. She smiled when she saw me, not the friendly kind, but the kind that expects agreement before a word is spoken. She said she was there to clarify access, as if the fence, the signs, and the recorded deed lines were somehow unclear. I told her calmly that there was no access to clarify, that this was private agricultural land, and that whoever had placed markers here had made a mistake. Her smile tightened, not offended, just recalculating. She explained that the HOA had approved a community improvement, a walking path for residents, and that my pasture sat along what she called a natural extension. I asked her to show me the paperwork. She didn't, and talked around it instead, using phrases like community benefit and shared responsibility, words meant to soften the fact that she was standing where she didn't belong. What struck me wasn't aggression, it was certainty. Karen spoke as if the decision had already been made, and the conversation was just a formality. She gestured toward the far fence line and said surveyors would be back soon, that this would all be easier if I cooperated early. I told her again, slower this time, that there was nothing to cooperate with. Her tone changed then, subtle but sharp. She warned me about being difficult, about how things tend to escalate when people refuse to work with the association. I had heard versions of that sentence before, in different contexts, always followed by consequences disguised as procedure. I told her she was trespassing and asked her to leave. For a moment she looked genuinely surprised, like the idea had never occurred to her that someone might say no. Then she laughed it off, stepped back toward her SUV, and said we'd talk again soon. After that, things began to move faster, not by accident. The markers came back within 48 hours, this time deeper into the pasture closer to where my cattle grazed. I documented everything, dates, positions, photos, and sent another certified notice. This one addressed directly to the HOA board. Again, silence. Silence is a tactic, especially when someone believes time is on their side. Then the notices started appearing on my gate, laminated sheets explaining upcoming community work, warning of temporary access disruptions, carefully avoiding the word permission. Each one assumed authority without proving it. I removed them as they appeared, but I could feel the pressure building, like someone stacking weight, waiting to see when something would give. The real shift came when neighbors began stopping at the fence line, not to argue, but to warn. One older man slowed his truck and told me quietly that Karen had been talking at meetings, saying resistance was expected but manageable. A woman walking her dog avoided eye contact and mentioned that the path was already being advertised in the community newsletter. None of them crossed the fence. They didn't need to. Their discomfort said enough. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was momentum. Karen had sold the idea before securing the right to do it, and now reality was in her way. I stayed calm because calm creates contrast. I filed a formal boundary affirmation with the county, requested updated survey confirmations, and pulled historical easement records going back decades. Everything matched what I already knew. No shared access, no implied right, no conditional language, clean lines, clear ownership. On paper, it was simple. In practice, it rarely is when ego gets involved. Karen didn't respond to the filings. Instead, she escalated sideways. I noticed a patrol car parked near the development entrance more often, lingering longer than usual. I didn't connect it immediately, but I logged it anyway. Patterns matter. A few days later, a code compliance officer drove slowly past my gate, never stopping, just observing. Then, another. None spoke to me. They didn't need to. Presence alone can be a message. The evening before everything broke open, I saw Karen again. This time, not at the gate, but near the interior fence line, walking the perimeter with her phone raised, narrating as she went. She spoke loudly, intentionally, about safety concerns, about animals near public spaces, about the need to act quickly. She didn't see me at first. When she did, she didn't stop recording. I told her once more that she was on private land and needed to leave. She waved me off, said she was documenting conditions for the board, and kept walking. That was the moment I realized she wasn't just pushing boundaries. She believed they no longer applied to her. People who document themselves often forget they're creating evidence for more than one audience. I called my dog back and watched her retreat, still talking, still convinced she was building a case. What she was really doing was stepping deeper into a situation she didn't control. By the time she reached her vehicle and drove off, I had already decided that whatever happened next would be handled by records, not reactions. But decisions like that don't stop people like Karen. They challenge them. And when authority feels challenged, it tends to test how far it can go. That test came sooner than I expected, and it came in a way neither of us could ignore. The next morning didn't bring an apology or a pause. It brought movement. Trucks I didn't recognize idled along the far edge of my property, engines humming like they were waiting for a signal. No logos, no uniforms, just men standing around, pretending not to look at the fence while clearly measuring it with their eyes. I watched from a distance and let them see me watching back. When they noticed, they didn't approach, they didn't wave, they simply left, which told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an accident. This was preparation. By midday, a new notice appeared at the gate, heavier than the others. This one stamped and signed, declaring the land temporarily restricted due to community safety assessment. No court order, no county seal, just Karen's confidence pressed into paper. I didn't tear it down immediately. I photographed it, logged it, and left it hanging where it could betray its own emptiness. Later that afternoon, I received my first phone call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end introduced himself as representing the association's interests and suggested, politely at first, that resisting early only made things harder. I told him the same thing I'd told Karen. that there was nothing to negotiate, because there was no authority to begin with. The politeness drained out of his voice fast. He mentioned potential liability, animal control concerns, even hinted at law enforcement involvement if public access was endangered. It was a performance, meant to sound official, meant to feel inevitable. I ended the call and noted the time. That evening, as the light dropped and the pasture went quiet, I noticed my dog grow tense, ears up, body rigid, the way he only does when something unfamiliar enters the space. I followed his line of sight and saw movement near the tree line. Not hurried, not cautious, just careless. Karen stepped into view like she had every right to be there. Phone already raised, narrating again. Louder this time, she talked about hazards, about aggressive animals, about the need for immediate intervention. I told her to leave. She didn't acknowledge the command. She walked closer to the barn, closer to the dog, still talking, still convinced that recording made her untouchable. When my dog moved to block her path, she reacted the wrong way. Instead of stopping, she reached for something. A metal rod she'd picked up, maybe to gesture, maybe to intimidate, maybe without thinking at all. That was the moment the situation stopped being about paperwork and became about safety. I shouted again, louder, sharper, and she turned, angry now, not scared, swinging the rod in a wild, careless motion meant to assert dominance. My dog lunged back instinctively, doing exactly what he was trained to do. Everything compressed into a single decision point. The sound that followed tore through the air and froze the pasture in place. Karen stopped moving. My dog retreated behind me. Dust hung where it had been kicked up seconds earlier. I didn't advance. I didn't shout. I stood still and watched the reality of the moment settle over her face. Whatever authority she thought she carried had just evaporated, replaced by the understanding that land does not care about titles, and neither do animals. She backed away, slowly, still filming, still talking. But the confidence was gone, replaced by something brittle and defensive. She said she'd call the police. I told her she should. Then I waited. The sirens came faster than I expected, echoing across the fields like punctuation at the end of a sentence. 2 patrol vehicles pulled up at the gate, lights cutting through the dusk, officers stepping out with the practiced caution of people responding to an uncertain call. Karen rushed toward them immediately, voice high, words tumbling over each other, pointing back toward the pasture, framing the story before anyone else could. I didn't interrupt. I never do. I waited until one of the officers turned to me and asked what happened. I told him calmly, exactly, without adjectives, without speculation. Trespass, posted land and escalation, threat to an animal. A single decisive action to stop it. The officers separated us, then walked the perimeter, looked at the signs, the fence, the notices still hanging where they shouldn't have been. One of them asked Karen for proof of access rights. She talked around the question, the way she always did. He asked again. She produced her phone and showed him the recording, confident it would save her. He watched it carefully, rewound parts, paused, frowned. The tone changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but decisively. Questions became specific. Requests became demands. Another unit arrived, then another. What had started as a complaint had become something else entirely. The officers spoke quietly among themselves, checking records, calling in parcel numbers, confirming boundaries that Karen had assumed away. She stood apart, now arms crossed, jaw tight still, trying to project control. When an officer finally told her she needed to leave the property immediately, and that further entry could result in charges, she looked stunned, like she'd misheard him. She tried to argue he didn't engage. He repeated himself and waited as they drove away. The pasture fell silent again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was heavier, loaded with consequence. I knew then that this wasn't ending with a warning or an apology. Karen had pushed too far, too publicly, and too many records had been created for it to disappear quietly. What she didn't know yet was that every step she'd taken, every assumption she'd made, had set the stage for something she could no longer manage. The line wasn't just crossed. It was documented. After the patrol cars disappeared down the road, I didn't celebrate and didn't relax. Moments like that can fool people into thinking the worst is over, but I knew better. Karen had been told to leave, not to stop. And there's a difference. People who rely on authority rarely accept limits quietly. They look for angles and for someone else to carry the weight they've dropped. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, not replaying what happened, but mapping what came next. Every notice she'd posted, every marker she'd placed, every recording she'd made, all of it had timestamps and context. Now, this wasn't about memory anymore. It was about sequence. The first thing I did was request the incident reports tied to that evening. Not summaries and narratives, but the raw reports, the kind that show who said what before anyone knew how the story would be framed. While those requests moved through the system, I pulled county records, zoning maps, historical easements, and development filings tied to the subdivision. I wasn't looking for something dramatic. I was looking for consistency or the lack of it. By morning, messages started coming in, not threats, not apologies, but quiet acknowledgments from people who'd been watching longer than I realized. One neighbor emailed to say Karen had been pushing for that path for months without approval. Another mentioned a board vote that never actually happened, only an announcement that it had. Someone forwarded a newsletter draft that never went out, advertising access that didn't exist yet. Each piece on its own meant nothing together. They formed a pattern of assumption being passed off as decision. I organized everything, labeled it, cross-referenced it with dates and filings. Authority doesn't collapse because of one bad act. It collapses when the story stops lining up with the record. 2 days later, the first incident report arrived. It was clean, factual, and careful. Warning issued, no charges, no drama. The second report, filed by the responding supervisor, added something more interesting. It referenced prior communications from the HOA regarding access disputes, flagged as civil matters outside enforcement scope. That line mattered. It meant Karen hadn't just crossed onto my land physically. She'd already tried to pull law enforcement into something they knew didn't belong to them. That kind of thing doesn't sit quietly in a system built on jurisdiction. It waits. I didn't contact Karen. I didn't contact the board. I let the paper move and filed a formal boundary affirmation with the county clerk, attaching survey confirmations and the incident reports. I requested a zoning compliance review for the proposed path, knowing full well it couldn't pass without proper authorization. I sent a single neutral notice to the HOA, stating that all unauthorized materials placed on my property needed to be removed within 72 hours. No threats, no commentary. Just a deadline backed by record. Silence followed, but it was a different kind now. It wasn't confident. It was cautious. By the end of the week, the markers were gone, not all at once. Not publicly, but quietly, as if someone hoped no one would notice. The notices stopped appearing. The trucks didn't come back. On the surface, it looked like retreat, but I knew it was recalibration. Karen wasn't done. She was just choosing a different approach. That approach revealed itself when a letter arrived from the association's legal counsel, formal in tone, vague in substance, requesting a meeting to resolve misunderstandings. I read it once and set it aside. Meetings are where people like her try to regain control of the narrative. I wasn't interested in conversation. I was interested in resolution that didn't depend on personalities. Instead of responding, I forwarded the letter to the county land use office along with my filings and requested guidance on unauthorized community developments. That triggered something Karen couldn't manage internally. The county doesn't move fast, but it moves deliberately. And once it starts asking questions, those questions don't stop at the answers people prefer. Inspectors scheduled site visits, requests for documentation went out. The HOA was asked to produce approvals it didn't have. Each request widened the gap between what Karen had claimed and what she could prove. Meanwhile, the tone in the community shifted. People who had avoided eye contact started waving. A couple of residents stopped by the fence, not to interfere, but to say thank you quietly, like they weren't sure gratitude was allowed yet. I didn't encourage it, and I didn't discourage it. I just listened. The common thread in every conversation was the same. The final piece fell into place when the county confirmed something Karen had conveniently ignored. The subdivision's development agreement explicitly prohibited expansion of community amenities beyond its original footprint without a supermajority vote and external approval. No shortcuts, no assumptions, no exceptions. That clause had been there from the beginning, buried in language no one read because no one thought they needed to. Karen had built her authority on confidence, not compliance. And confidence doesn't survive contact with text. I knew then that the story was no longer about me or my land. It was about governance, accountability, and what happens when someone mistakes visibility for power. Karen could still shout. She could still posture. But the ground beneath her decisions had shifted, and she hadn't noticed yet. The real confrontation wasn't going to happen at the fence or the pasture. It was going to happen in a room where every word mattered, and every record would be read out loud. And once that happened, there would be no editing the outcome. The notice didn't come from Karen, and that's how I knew things had shifted for good. It arrived by certified mail, plain envelope, county seal, no drama attached. A formal review had been opened regarding unauthorized land use, misrepresentation of access rights, and improper communication with law enforcement. No accusations yet, just questions, the kind that don't go away once they're asked. This was the moment the story stopped being personal and became procedural, and procedure doesn't bend for confidence. Karen reacted the only way she knew how, by trying to outrun the paper. The board suddenly announced an emergency meeting, framed as a chance to reset expectations and clarify misunderstandings. The language was softer now, careful like someone walking across thin ice. Flyers went out fast. Emails followed. The tone wasn't authoritative anymore. It was defensive. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. Everything they could say in a room had already been contradicted by records filed elsewhere. The county requested minutes from meetings Karen had cited but never properly held. They asked for approvals that had been implied but not recorded. They requested copies of notices that had appeared on my gate without authorization. Each request pulled another thread. The board's responses grew slower, less confident, filled with phrases like "in progress" and "pending clarification." That kind of language doesn't reassure regulators, it alarms them. Then came the call from the association's attorney. Not aggressive, not friendly, just careful. He wanted to understand my position, to explore options, and to avoid escalation. I told him there was nothing to explore. The land was mine, and the record already reflected that. Silence followed, heavier than before. You can hear it when someone realizes they've been defending something that doesn't exist. Karen tried one last move, issuing a statement to residents framing the situation as a temporary pause caused by external review. She avoided names and avoided responsibility. It didn't work. People had seen the patrol cars. They'd seen the markers disappear. They'd heard the rumors. Once authority looks uncertain, it loses the ability to command trust. And trust is the only thing it ever really had. The county scheduled a formal hearing date, and that was it. No more back channels. No more assumptions. A room, a record, and questions asked in order. Karen was no longer controlling the timeline. She was reacting to it. I marked the date on my calendar and went back to my routine, feeding livestock, fixing fence posts, letting normal life continue. That contrast mattered. While she scrambled, I stayed steady. By the time the hearing notice became public, the outcome was already taking shape. Karen hadn't just crossed a fence. She'd crossed into a process designed to strip away anything built on shortcuts. This wasn't about proving her wrong anymore. It was about documenting how wrong she'd been, step by step, in a way that couldn't be undone. And once that kind of process starts, it doesn't stop until someone is held accountable. The hearing room was smaller than Karen had probably imagined. No stage, no crowd to command, just a long table, a recorder, and a clock that refused to slow down for confidence. She arrived early, folders stacked high, posture rigid, still trying to project control. It didn't last. One by one, the questions stripped away the shortcuts she'd relied on. Who approved the access? When? Under what authority? Where were the votes? Where were the filings? Each answer led to another document, and each document contradicted the story she'd told for months. The county didn't raise its voice. It didn't need to. It read the record out loud: trespass documented, unauthorized notices posted, law enforcement contacted without jurisdiction, public safety claims unsupported. When the chair finally spoke, it wasn't dramatic, just final. Karen was removed from her position, effective immediately. The HOA was barred from asserting authority beyond its original footprint. A civil penalty was assessed for misuse of process and false representation. An injunction followed, permanent, prohibiting any future entry onto my land or communication implying access. Fines were imposed, heavy enough to sting, structured enough to last. The board was ordered to undergo external oversight and compliance. Training not as a suggestion, but as a condition to continue operating at all. Karen tried to speak, to explain intent, to reframe motives. But intent doesn't erase impact. The decision stood. When it was over, she didn't look angry. She looked small, like someone who had finally realized that confidence without authority is just noise. I left without saying a word. There was nothing left to say. The punishment wasn't loud or personal. It was precise, lasting, and impossible to undo. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. No more trucks slowing at my gate, no more paper tucked where it didn't belong, no more voices claiming authority they never had. The pasture settled back into itself, grass bending with the wind, like it always had. The kind of calm you don't notice until it's been taken from you and returned on honest terms. My dog stayed close for a few days, watchful but relaxed, the way animals get when danger finally leaves their scent. The county signs went up a week later, clear and boring and powerful in their simplicity. Boundary marked, access denied, enforcement limited. That was the point. No drama, no confusion, just lines that couldn't be argued anymore. Neighbors who'd stayed quiet before started waving again. One stopped by to say they'd watched what happened and decided to pull their own records. Another admitted they'd been scared to push back until they saw someone do it without yelling. The board sent a formal notice acknowledging the ruling, stripped of spin, written by lawyers who understood consequences. Karen didn't come back. She couldn't. Her name was attached to orders that would follow her longer than any title ever did. Oversight took over. Meetings became dull. That was a win. I walked the fence at sunset, checking posts, listening to the land breathe, the dog pacing ahead like he always had. Nothing heroic about it. Just ownership restored, and a lesson written where it mattered. Authority doesn't come from volume or threats. It comes from permission, process, and respect for lines you didn't draw. When those are ignored, the answer isn't chaos, it's clarity. And once clarity shows up, everything else gets real quiet, real fast. If you've ever been pushed by someone who thought rules were a weapon, say it out loud in the comments. And if this story hit home, stick around. There are more where overreach meets consequences, and the ground remembers who it belongs to.